Hello students, this video lecture will cover chapters 8, 9, and 10 from Daytripper. Just as a reminder, here are some of the central themes that we've analyzed throughout the book. We've analyzed the theme of family, including how the role of fatherhood and the role of father and son is an important theme in the book when it relates to family. Next, we've looked at the role nature plays between the contrast of natural life and the city. We've analyzed how Moon and Ba use a pastoral sense of writing to present nature as a place for reflection and growth. We, of course, have analyzed the importance death plays as a theme, especially the notion that death is not separate from life, but death is a part of life. We've also looked how they've created metaphors around the death drive and understanding death as a cycle, as a part of a cycle of rebirth. We've also analyzed truth, how Brás's attempt to find what is true and important about his life has led him to the realization that it is living in particular and important moments, not the attempt to find grand narratives, which is the key to having a good and healthy life. Chapter 7, if you would watch the previous video, presents Jorge as a negative example of how to view death. If you remember that Jorge has become a metaphoric symbol of the death drive, the Freudian concept of the death drive, and Jorge's murder-suicide is a metaphor of that attitude towards death. Chapter 8 presents an alternative to Jorge's. So in Chapter 8, we see that Brás is a best-selling author. He has a wife and son that seem to adore him. This chapter presents Brás as surrounded by his past, his present, and his future. You know, his mother, his wife, his young son. However, Brás himself is never presented in the chapter. This is the only chapter where Brás as a character is not present. But despite the fact that he is absent from the chapter, the way that this chapter presents its actions shows us that his presence is felt even more so by the fact that the character never appears. His presence is felt by his very absence. The notion of absence, of Brás's absence from the story in particular, is highlighted when Miguel and Ana visit Aurora, who is Brás's mom. In the section of panels presented to you here, you see how they discuss the use of smoke, the fact that both Brás and Benedito were both smokers, to reference that even though they are not there, it feels like they are because they can smell that smoke. How the type of brand of cigarette that they go doesn't go unnoticed, and it is right there in front of them when they smell it. It brings them back to that moment. So the smell of smoke is a metaphor for the presence via absence, how someone can be present in your life even if they are no longer there. Now we see, as this discussion is going on, Miguel wandering through Benedito's office. This scene should measure what Brás says in Chapter 4. If you remember in Chapter 4, Brás said that everything in this office felt grand and larger than life. Miguel here is experiencing that very feeling, right? So once again, we have Benedito's office as an example of the name of the father, of how the roles of fatherhood can pass down through generations, right? If you remember, the name of the father combined more than just the actual person. It analyzed the very notion of fatherhood in general. Even though by Chapter 8, as a reader, you should expect that Brás will somehow die in the chapter, Brás's death is foreshadowed in this depiction of the Lion King that Miguel is watching on television. Miguel is watching the scene in the movie where Mufasa dies. This, of course, foreshadows Brás's own death. Also note how the foreshadowing nature here represents the role of father and son. If you see the scene in which Miguel is watching, he's saying, "Dad would have let me watch it," which, of course, his dad is no longer there. So chapter 8 moves to its central point. All right, this is the final statement of how to deal with trauma that Moon and Ba, as our authors, present to us. So if you remember, the reaction to the trauma of the plane crash, we saw Jorge turn inward, completely shutting off others and becoming a metaphor for the destructive aspects of the death drive. Where Brás learned that opening up to others is a way to help heal from trauma. Anna now is given the exact same choice, the exact same decision when she learns about Brás's death. Right? If you see and look at the panels here, if you look at the bottom right panel, notice how her presentation here with the overly wide eyes, with the use of light to highlight the eyes, the close-up on the face, mirrors the scene when Brás views the plane crash. We get an exact same sort of techniques here to show you that this character is undergoing a traumatic reaction. So the rest of this chapter really wants to focus on Anna's presentation and Anna's role in how to deal with this trauma. We get various foreshadowing elements that lead us in one way, and then the end of the chapter shows us another. So, for example, in terms of foreshadowing, right, if you look at this scene where Anna is picking up Miguel and she falls into the water, loses her phone, this scene could be read as something foreshadowing her drowning, being pulled down into the same spiral of death drive attitudes that killed Jorge, because Anna herself is faced with the same choice Jorge and Brás felt when dealing with the trauma. She can choose the death drive, or she can choose the life drive. Earlier in our discussion of this chapter, we noted that you feel Brás's presence as a character through his absence. On page 195, we have a clear representation of what we mean by the absence of presence, or the presence of absence, depending on how you want to look at it. The empty typewriter, the empty chairs, the voice we hear on the phone, all show us that even when people pass on, they are still there. This is adding to Moon and Ba's notion that death is not separate from life, but something that continues through the lives of others. We still feel the smoke. Benedito and Brás's cigarettes brings them back and presents them to Anna and Aurora. Here we have the same thing, the presence of absence, how even when someone is gone, they can still be present in the lives of others. After this scene, we are represented with Anna's initial despair. If we look at this scene and these pages on this panel, it seems like Anna is reacting to Brás's death in a way that is similar to Jorge's. I would argue that she is having post-traumatic stress disorder from the news that Brás is dead, much like Jorge and Brás did in the chapters with the plane crash. We see her on the couch, the panels are washed out in a gray, lifeless tone. We see that she is disheveled, seems like she's barely slept. She's cutting herself off from people and obsessing on the last voicemail. This is a very sort of cliched presentation. You've probably seen it in a bunch of movies and TV shows where when somebody passes, the person keeps listening over and over to the last voice message. It's a way to focus and cut yourself off from others and obsess only on what caused the trauma. It is from this point where it seems like Anna might turn and have a more Jorge-like reaction to the death of Brás. But thankfully, the chapter ends with Anna rejecting this notion. Compared to the death of chapter 7, we see Anna take the alternative approach. Instead of continuing to focus inward, continuing to cut herself off from others, we instead get a scene of her turning to other people. We see her hugging her son Miguel. We see the puppy there as well, as this new family is given a presentation of a family that will go on. Right? If you look at the way the scene is presented, look at the changes in color. We now have warm, rich color tones, lots of oranges. The color has returned to the character's skin. We get a much more greater sense of warmth that even though this family has gone through something traumatic, they will continue, they will persist, and heal from it. The narrator even backs this up in the captions, where it says that Brás lived on forever in his books, in the memory of his readers, and in the hearts of his wife Ana and their son Miguel. This caption again references the power of community, of other people, to help us move on and grow from trauma. So at the end, Ana makes the exact opposite decision of Jorge and chooses to heal and move on from her trauma by turning towards those that she loves. Chapter 9 focuses heavily on the aspects of dreams. Brás calls himself a dreamer. He states that his dreams help him understand where I come from and where I want to go. And Brás describes dreams as what his life can be once he opens his eyes. Dreams here refer to the idea of partial truth. For Moon and Ba, dreams aren't real. They can't be, quote unquote, true. But what they reveal about ourselves, about our hidden desires and consciousnesses, are true. Very similar to their use of death drive, again, Moon and Ba are drawing on Freudian interpretations that dreams are our unconscious wishes made manifest. So they reveal our truth back to us, but only in moments. Remember too, chapter 2, Brás is particularly asked by Olinda what are his dreams. At that point, he had no answer. So chapter 9. Chapter 9 is a direct callback to chapter 2, with Brás floating on a boat in the darkened sea with the goddess Irminja. She tells Brás that in order to go after your dreams, you must live your life. Wake up before it's too late. This is the statement on the idea of dreams by Moon and Ba. Namely, you must understand what you want by interrogating your unconscious desires and feelings. Waiting, planning, and thinking about life only in terms of a grand narrative will only lead to stagnation. You will not be able to live your life. So Moon and Ba, dreams here review the concept of partial truths. As we all know, dreams aren't true. That's how we define dreams versus reality. But what they reveal about ourselves and our desires, dreams are true. So let's analyze some of the key moments and dreams that Brás has throughout this chapter. It should be noted, some students have difficulty understanding this chapter, but just realize that everything that you see is a dream. All right? It is Brás dreaming. There is no point within this chapter that you are not in the dreamlike state of Brás. So again, we have this scene with Jorge reminding us and Brás that without other people, life is a desert. Note too that he is drawn like the Jorge that killed Brás, but instead is acting and giving him lessons like the younger Jorge imparts to Brás. I think this is Moon and Ba's attempt to recuperate some of the character of Jorge, to turn him from such a negative example and stress his importance as being a friend and compatriot to Brás throughout his life. So now we move to the central aspect of the chapter, the key part of this whole notion of dreams. All right, what do the dreams reveal to Brás? What is the truth they reveal to Brás? The truth that they reveal to Brás is how to understand the role of death as a part of life. You will notice in this scene, we are back under the tree of knowledge. If you remember from chapter 5, this tree represents the tree of knowledge that can be found at the Garden of Eden. This scene, these few pages and these collections of panels are the key moment when it comes to the theme that life is a part of death. These 2 pages show how Moon and Ba believe their readers should understand the concept of death. We have all 3 notions of father presented to you with Benedito, Brás, and now Miguel, father and son. And Brás tells Miguel he's going to tell him a story about death, because any story about death is really about life, since death has such a big part in it referring to life. Miguel responds that he doesn't like death. He doesn't want to hear a story about death. But Brás tells him that no one really does. But the truth is, like it or not, Everybody dies. So Brás then tells Miguel a metaphor of how death is like a book. No book is complete without an end, therefore death gives meaning to life. Knowing death is there for us all at the end of our journeys is nothing to despair. Instead, Brás is trying to tell Miguel that death is something that can provide meaning to life. He states, "Life is like a book, and every book has an end. No matter how much you like that book, you will get to the last page, and it will end." This declaration of death as the end of the book should tell you that it is not different from the book. The last pages of a story are still a part of the story. So death is not something separate from life. It is not when you put the book down, it is instead the last words of life. So they continue. Brás tells his son that death is the only way that we can understand that life is real, how life is different from our dreams, how life is different from a sense of fantasy or irreality. Brás tells Miguel, and by telling Miguel is also talking to us, the readers, that he will see no book is complete without its end. And once you get there, only when you read the last words will you see how good the book is. It feels real. So by reshaping this death this way as the end of the book, the last pages of a story that is our lives, Moon and Ba are trying to argue that death is the guarantee that our life was worth living. Death makes everything that we do feel real because it is the only thing that guarantees that our life was in fact there. It's only by us not being here that we can finally adjust and understand what we did when we were alive. Chapter 10 then continues this truth that was expressed in Chapter 9. If Chapter 9, in the dream section, suggests to readers that death is the only thing that makes life worth living, it is the only thing that guarantees that our life was real, Chapter 10 then suggests here's what we should do with our life. If we understand death as the guarantee for life, how do we go about living then a good life with this knowledge that we are going to pass away? So Chapter 10 gives us the final notion of how we should live according to Moon and Ba, our authors. Chapter 10 begins with Brás learning that his cancer has returned and he has decided against treatment. Brás decides to live his life, what he has left, instead of having a poor quality of life going through the tremendously painful treatments that deal with anybody with cancer. At the end of the chapter, Brás receives a letter, and this letter imparts the true nature of what Moon and Ba, as our authors, think life is, and more importantly, how we should live it. After deciding that he will not seek treatment, we see Brás take the train back to his new home. It's important to note that the layout of the pages 232 and 233 present you another graphic understanding of the theme of nature versus city. In the city, Brás learned about his death, but as in the nature, a home Brás has not surprisingly chosen to make in a beautiful and natural setting, that Brás will return to his life, to Anna and his family and those that he loves. As the chapter continues, Brás has a family snack or meal with Miguel and Anna. We learn in this section on 239 that Miguel and his family have moved into the Domingos family home, where Brás grew up. This is another metaphor for the cyclical nature of life and death. If you remember on chapter 2, we were told that during the festival of Ermenja, many people die in the ocean, but a similar number of people are born. And we've seen this metaphor track from chapter 2 about how when somebody passes on, someone new is born. We have this played out again in the last chapter. We learn that Brás and Anna no longer live there. We see that Brás has a terminal cancer diagnosis, but Miguel and his young family have moved into the home. So the home does not stay empty. Instead, new people are coming in to take the place of those who left. Death is a part of a cyclical transition of life and birth. Life to death to rebirth. So finally we get to the letter. This letter is the central message of chapter 10, and one that Moon and Ba used to tie together their entire theory of how we should live life, how we should understand that death is the action and cause for us to live the best way possible. So let's read this on pages 242 to 243 to see what Moon and Ba's final statement on the relationship of life and death is. So as you remember, this is a letter to Benedito. This was a letter that Brás should have found all the way back in chapter 5 when Benedito dies. It's the letter in his book, but of course Brás never takes it out. So he's receiving this letter in the timeline of Brás's life when Miguel was born. So here's Benedito writing from the grave to his son. Dear son, you're holding this letter now because this is the most important day of your life. You're about to have your first child. That means the life you've built with such effort, that you've conquered, that you've earned, has finally reached the point where it no longer belongs to you. This baby is the new master of your life. He is the sole reason for your existence. You'll surrender your life to him, give him your heart and soul because you want him to be strong, to be brave enough to make all of his decisions without you. So when he finally grows older, he won't need you. That's because you know one day you won't be there for him anymore. Only when you accept that one day you will die can you let go and make the best out of life. And that's the big secret. That's the miracle. So if we analyze the message of this letter, the message of this letter is saying that only once you understand that you can die, then you will start doing the most important thing that you can do with your life, which is help others have their best life, to help prepare others to live on their own so that when you are no longer there, they will have healthy, successful, and wonderful lives. At its core, this letter claims that empathy is more important than essence. What do we mean by that? Empathy, as we have discussed in other parts of this semester, is the understanding and recognition of other people, the acknowledgement that other people's feelings and existence are legitimate and real. Essence here would be considering what we think of as a good person, right? What a good person does, regardless of what they do in relation to others. For Moon and Ba, empathy is more important than essence. Having an idea of what good is not as important as the actions that you do for others. So they say that life then is preparing to be able to understand that others will live beyond you, and you need to do the best you can with the responsibility you have for other people. So Moon and Ba, in their way, reveals the miracle, the big secret, and the sole reason for existence is the treatment of other people. The miracle is the notion of responsibility, which means that you can live life and treat others so that when a person dies, your loved ones are there to live their best lives beyond you. This is the secret about death. Death compels you towards a responsibility for other people, where you can find a situation where you can admit that your friends and family don't need you anymore. This then allows you to prepare yourself to treat them the best way possible with the time that you have. Chapter 10 ends on an ambiguous note, where Brás has this beautiful sort of communion with the sea. As you see, he brings out 3 flowers that he throws into the water, giving Ermenja her sacrifice. Right? The 3 flowers can be used and discussed ambiguously. However, I think the 3 flowers are his mother, his father, and Jorge. The 3 people, the 3 major characters that we have seen pass by this point in the book. And then Brás goes out and stands in the water. Some students have been confused at this ending, wondering whether or not he dies. I would argue that that's not important. We already know from the beginning of the chapter that Brás is already dying. What is important here is that Brás has understood that he has lived a good life, that he has fulfilled his responsibility for others, that he has prepared them to not need him anymore. He has fulfilled his responsibility, and by fulfilling his responsibility, has, for Moon and Ba, lived the best life possible. He has lived a life for other people. And that's the point of admit that you don't need me anymore. For Moon and Ba, then, they want the reader to understand that death is the driving force to make our life and the lives of loved ones better. Death is not the end of life. Death is the last stage of life that guarantees and drives us to live our best possible lives by helping others to succeed. It is this ability to admit that death will drive us to prepare others to succeed when we will not be there anymore. For Moon and Ba, life is about taking responsibility for those that you love. By the end of chapter 10, Brás is a character that learns this lesson. He learns the major lesson of the book. Death is not a death drive towards self-destruction or control, but a way to make our lives valuable by preparing a better life for others. That is the end for our discussion of Daytripper. I hope you enjoyed the book. If you have any other questions, please watch the previous video lectures on the other chapters.